Hello and welcome to We Got Planning News for You. Can I start by my usual reminder to consider making a donation to charity new registration free? The charities we support, as regular viewers will know by now, include Brian May's Save Me Trust, Shelter, but please choose a charity of your choice.
I'll take it. I think I might just take over there. I'm going to invite you, young Charlie, to mute yourself for a minute, or at least to turn your camera off, because you come in and out and it's a bit distracting for our esteemed guest, Steve. What he wants to know, Steve, is where are you calling from and what are you drinking and what's your theme?
Well, I'm calling from my office in Soho Estate, so I'm looking out of the window at effectively sort of Tottenham Court Road tube station. Particularly interested in the Tottenham Court Road because, of course, it's home to the Elizabeth Line or Rail, which I first took through Parliament in the 1990s. Been a baby of mine ever since. They opened it on my birthday a year ago. And I told them that, obviously, that was very kind of them. And they said, really. But so that's right. I'm not drinking at the moment. I'm kind of abstemious.
Very sensible, very sensible.
But I'm going on to the House of Commons later, or House of Lords, I think it is later, for a reception. So I might just have a little snort there.
I reckon I'm going to see you at the reception later, Steve, so that you can be my hot date for tonight. What's your theme? What's your theme, Steve?
My theme? Well, I think my theme at the moment is what's happened to Michael Gove. I think that is probably my
okay.
My thing, I think ever since he got filmed in that club in Aberdeen, twirling around like a banshee, he's kind of become a different person, and I love it a bit. I'm very fond of Michael, and he's extremely bright. But there's a switch that has gone the wrong way, and I'm determined to find out what it is. Maybe if he has to have, medical treatment, maybe I could recommend somebody suitable. Boy's completely lost the plot. There you go. That's my thing.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Steve. And we very much look forward to Chris's interview with you later. Charlie, are you ready to take back your seat? No, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. I'm going to carry on. So, I have no idea who's supposed to be doing the first case summary. Anybody know who's supposed to be doing the first case summary?
You're probably going to ask us where we all are, Mary, probably.
Yeah. Oh, probably. I'm going to introduce myself and you. Quite right. Quite right. So, esteemed audience, is Mary Cook from Town Legal, speaking from the city in London. And where, Chris, are you?
I'm in Coventry. Now, Sasha constantly teases me about the hotels I go to because he demands a better standard of hotel than I do. But this time I've hit gold. So I'm in Coventry doing a proposal for 700 houses in a 21-story tower on a regeneration site supported by Andy Street, who's been a guest on this show. And it happens that my client, who's done lots of regeneration in Coventry, Ian Harrabin, you'll know the name because his brother is Roger Harrabin, the BBC environment correspondent. And the Harrabin family have been doing lots of redevelopment. And when the Telegraph, the local newspapers offices, which are a classic modernist 1950s building, looked like they'd be demolished, he stepped in, saved it, and turned it into this fabulous, funky 1950s hotel. So I'm in a much better hotel this week than Sasha is. And that's all that matters to me. There's an RTPI meeting on the roof at the rooftop bar at 6:00. We're going to go and crash that. And Steve, you did suggest the theme was the Beatles, so that's my favourite band, and we'll get on to why that might be your theme a bit later.
Yeah,
super.
I should turn the Michael Gove one.
Yes, I rather agree. Sasha, how are you?
I'm very well. I'm in London. I'm returned from darkest West Sussex where I was doing an inquiry earlier this week. I don't accept Chris was in a better hotel than me, and I never will. But I'm now returned to London. And I want to say, in the light of Steve's theme, I want to announce quietly and modestly that I once was babysat by Yoko Ono and John Lennon as a baby. So that's my connection to the Beatles, because my father produced the happenings. Yoko Ono went for a phase. Steve might remember it when I think she put on happenings when absolutely nothing happened. Everyone was too frightened to say this is a load of rubbish. I shouldn't speak about my father's past productions in that way, but that's as I understand it.
Yeah. How very interesting. And Paul, the King of the North, how are you?
Well, firstly, cheers, Steve. Delight to see you. Secondly, in terms of what I'm drinking, I have excelled myself by buying something called a Ruby Red Ale, which you'll be delighted to know is a crimson-coloured ale full of plum, prunes, and raisins with a touch of toffee, so that will keep me regular. And in terms of my links to the Beatles, this is a little bit out there. I have a friend who's the former lead guitarist of the punk band The Stiffs, who were big in the 1970s. So this is their album, their greatest hits, just released. He's not signed it though, which is interesting. And apparently they also managed to record some of the songs that are on that album in the Abbey Road studio. So that's my link to the Beatles. Little contrived, but I've only known about this for the last 30 seconds.
That's incredible. I'm just going to do my segue here because I've got a great book all about the Abbey Road studios with an interesting foreword by Sir George Martin. In that case, I'm going to go straight into the first case, and I'm going to take you all to Shenley. And Shenley is a case all about the Greenbelt, and sadly, it's an example of an unsuccessful appeal. This time, the developer was seeking planning permission for up to 37 homes, and our lovely Rob is going to give you the there you are. You can see the inspector, you can see the details. So Grig Options Limited were the appellant here, and they were seeking to get planning permission on the basis that they could demonstrate very special circumstances. Now, I'm bound to say, you'll notice the date of this, the 25th of May. A much more interesting decision, people, came out the day after involving Castle Point. I know that because I did that, and we got permission in Castle Point on the Greenbelt for 44 affordable homes for Legal and General, and thanks very much to all my team. But I digress. But it's interesting that this appeal was an inquiry over 6 days. Mine was a hearing over 1 day. And it's just curious as to how it is that some things end up being inquiries and some things end up being hearings. Sometimes there doesn't appear to be much rhyme or reason behind that to the outside eye, so it's difficult to advise clients. But the Shenley appeal involved the usual sorts of issues. And Rob, you also have a plan which might be of interest, just to give everybody a sense. So there you are. There you can see Shenley, and you can see that this site was on the northeast, and there were some. You can see the dotted footpaths. A lot of those photographs, the photographic locations are from the public footpaths, so you get a sense of it. And really, this was a site which had been allocated for 50 houses in a Regulation 18 local plan, but that plan had been, quote, set aside. And so the inspector attached no weight to that, but he did consider that the evidence supporting the draft was relevant. He was interested in the impact on openness, the purposes, the character and appearance, but there was also a site-specific issue, which was around noise and the implications in respect of adjoining businesses and whether those businesses potentially would be prejudiced by the new homes. In the end, the inspector thought that issue could be dealt with by condition, and although every party, both the appellant and the council, called noise evidence, and indeed in this case the local parish council was a Rule 6 party, and they also called noise evidence. In the end, that issue was dealt with by way of a condition. So the nub of it was that the inspector considered that the site's southern boundary was quite open, and that the site would be visible, the proposal would be quite visible from these public vantage points, i.e. the 2 footpaths that I pointed out earlier. And the appellants had tried to argue that they could come forward with an infill scheme under paragraph 149E of the NPPF. And keen listeners will know that that is where you can have a limited infill in a greenbelt village. But the inspector had no truck with that at all, because he said that that was a theoretical proposition which carried no weight, because no scheme had actually been approved, no infill scheme had been approved by the council. So he gave short shrift to that, as I say, and he concluded that there would be a clear conflict with Purpose C of the Greenbelt purposes due to the encroachment of the countryside, and he judged there to be moderate localised visual impacts, which would have a moderately harmful effect on the character and appearance. There was no 5-year housing land supply. There was an issue about whether it was 2.25 or 1.58. The inspector gave the appellants the benefit of the doubt. He attributed significant weight to the new housing. He attributed, that's the open market. He also attributed significant weight to the 15 affordable housing units. Interestingly, he attributed limited weight to the self-build plots. And there was also some public open space being introduced. But again, he gave that limited weight because there was nearby playing fields and publicly accessible open space. So all of those things combined with his views on harm to openness, harm in terms of purpose, and harm to character and appearance, largely because of the views from the public footpaths, caused him to conclude that the benefits did not clearly outweigh the harms, and so very special circumstances were not established. And so we move swiftly on to the case that you are advancing, Sasha.
I am. I'm going to, if Rob gets up, I'm going to do a case in Devizes, which involved one of our esteemed panellists, and land off Cope Road, Devizes. Now, this is great. This is a really good appeal, and I want to commend Andrew McGlone, the inspector. I've never actually done an inquiry before him, and I'm not due to do one. So what I'm about to say is not in any way an indication of the future. But this is the most classic exposition of the correct approach to Section 38(6). And it's sad that it's a rarity, frankly. But what this case involves, as Paul knows well, is an application for residential development in the context of Wiltshire, where there was no agreed position, no 5-year land supply. So it was argued the range was between 4.3 and 4.7 years. And what the inspector had to grapple with was the compliance or not with the development plan. And then, of course, in the light of the 5-year land supply position, whether the tilted balance was in play and whether the impacts effectively significantly demonstrably outweighed the benefits. Now, in this case, the inspector concluded in the clearest terms that the proposal did not comply with the development plan, largely because of the policies that applied as a result of its location. And what the inspector did was take the view that whilst there was some harm, and there was particularly some harm to the setting of the A and B, the policy in the development plan that related to setting did not fully reflect the latest MPPF on such matters. And what the conclusion overall was that effectively the harm, both to landscape and the setting of the A and B, and non-compliance with the development plan, was outweighed by other material considerations, which of course market housing, affordable housing, the economic benefits, etc. And that both in terms of the application of Section 38(6) and the tilted balance lay in favour of the appellant. And as I said, I think it's an absolute classic example of grappling successfully and appropriately with Section 38(6). So congratulations to Paul and his team, and particularly the inspector, for reaffirming one's faith in its correct operation. So that's my case.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Paul, over to you now, please.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for those kind words, Sasha. One of the joys of our job is that you learn things that you never expected to learn. So one of the rabbit holes we went down at that inquiry was to learn that the Kennet and Avon Canal was part of the designated defences for the Second World War in the event that Operation Sea Lion had taken place. So one of the consequences of that appeal will be there will be a blue plaque on the bridge immediately adjacent to that to tell the public what certainly I didn't know before, and how important that area might well have been had things gone badly for us back in 1940. So yeah, I learned something new and something important at that appeal. So my case involves a coal case. It's a case of the Crown on the application of the Coal Authority network against Welsh ministers and the Coal Authority and Energy Build Mining. Coal mining is something that's very close to my heart, not least because 2 weeks before my graduation as a law graduate at Cambridge University, my maternal grandfather told me, "Whatever you do with this degree, lad, don't go down the pit," which was not something that was especially likely, but it was good advice from my granddad who had been down the pit. Well, this case is a decision of Mrs. Justice Stein following a hearing back in March, and it was a judicial review into an authorisation of a licence by the Coal Authority and also a non-intervention by Welsh ministers. And it relates to a mining licence, or rather a continuation of a mining licence with a variation, covering 1,131 hectares in the Vale of Neath. The licence had actually been authorised back in 1985, just before the Coal Board had been authorised, and mining had continued on and off since then. And that was important because the case turned upon interpretation of a couple of sections in the Coal Industry Act 1994, and this was a judicial review brought by a group opposed to the use of coal mining, and it's then the use of coal in energy production in the UK and Wales in particular. So the challenge against Welsh ministers was that Welsh ministers hadn't used the power in Section 26A of the 1994 Act to essentially block the authorisation, which had been granted in terms of a change to the licence, and I'm simplifying it by calling it a change, which had been granted by the Coal Authority. That part of the judicial review failed against Welsh ministers because the court concluded that in fact the Welsh ministers had only a comparatively limited power in relation to their power to essentially intervene in circumstances where there was already licensed activity. The other part of the judicial review, which is against the Coal Authority, was to say the Coal Authority should have taken into account the policy opposition of the Welsh government to the continuation of coal mining to enable coal mining for energy production. This was an anthracite pit. And Mrs. Justice Stein concluded, no, because the statutory framework only enabled the Coal Authority to consider a limited number of considerations when considering a continuation of a licence or a change to the licence, and that essentially this had been an ongoing operation since the 1980s. In fact, she observed that the Coal Authority had taken account of factors in addition to that, but this wasn't a case where there was a challenge of taking into account too many factors. It was a case of not taking account of the policy of the Welsh Assembly government. So the claim failed on both grounds. And if you were to look at it narrowly, you would say that there were a couple of narrow grounds of challenge under a comparatively niche act, the 1994 Coal Industry Act. But, and I think this is the takeaway from the case for viewers, it really does identify that the use of coal mining within energy production is now a very hot political potato, such that challenges of this nature and challenges that are elsewhere in the court system in relation to the use of carbon fuels to generate energy are now likely to be occupying the court time quite considerably. I suspect this may not be the last that we've heard of the Coal Industry Act, but I'll happily raise a glass to my maternal grandfather for his advice not to go down the pit, which is a good one. Thank you very much indeed, Mary.
Me too. And may I say, is this your new very smart study in your new very smart grade, whatever it is, listed building? It really is. Yeah, it's very, very pucker, Mr. Tucker, what I would say. Yes. Wow.
Look
amazing. That's very impressive. I'm missing Ursula's art.
It's on the floor over there.
Well, I think you need to get Ursula's art up on the wall. For Steve's benefit, Ursula is Paul's wife, and we love looking at her art. So, Charlie, we're going to take a risk.
Can you hear me? I gotta put my camera on. I'm at a military base in Northern Ireland, which is used as a firing range. I've not yet been shot. There's also a nature conservation site known as the Gilligan Point, full of rare orchids, etc. I'm here on with the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, whose board I sit on. And I'm going to talk, if you can still hear me. I have no idea whether you can or can't, but I'm going to carry on talking in the hope that you can. I'm going to talk about a judgment of the Court of Appeal in a planning enforcement case called Barry Devine and the Secretary of State levelling up. This was a judgment I delivered a few weeks ago where the Lord Justice Limbon gave the lead judgment, and he dismissed an appeal relating to an enforcement notice which concerned the unauthorised construction of what was alleged to be a new building in the Greenbelt, but which Mr. Devine said was an alteration to an existing building. And part of the issue is the extent to which the works had rendered the building something new. The question being whether the inspector had been legally entitled to take the view that, as a matter of fact and degree, the pre-existing building had been replaced by something new, having regard to the extent of the works. And the second question, whether the building was properly characterised as intended for residential use. The reason being that if it was characterised as residential use, it wasn't substantially completed sufficiently before the enforcement notice because it wasn't fitted out for residential use. He said it wasn't intended for residential use. The Court of Appeal dismissed his appeal in agreement with the High Court. The court held that a new building had been constructed, that although there had been some use of the fabric of the original building, the inspector had been entitled to take the invaluative planning judgment. Where we heard that phrase before from Lord Justice Limbon, I asked rhetorically, entitled to take that judgment that it was, as a matter of fact and degree, a new building. So that was the first aspect of the appeal dismissed. It did need planning permission. The question then became, was it timed out on the basis that the development had substantially completed 4 years prior to the enforcement notice? And in that respect too, Lord Justice Limbon found there was no basis for criticising the inspector's approach regarding time limitation. In particular, the court considered, this is probably the most important bit, it wasn't unlawful for the inspector to have regard to the purpose of the building, namely residential. The purpose the court considered was plain, given the physical appearance and layout of the building, as a matter of objective construction. So, as though earlier case law suggested that the subjective purpose of the developer was irrelevant, objectively, this was a building that claimed clearly intended residential. Therefore, the fact it hadn't been fully kitted out already meant that it hadn't been substantially completed in sufficient time for the enforcement measures to be immune, unable to be effective due to expiry of time. Clearly, this was unfortunate as the Court of Appeal noted for Mr. Devine, because not only did he lose the unauthorised development, he had to knock down the original bits too that were there beforehand. But the court held that wasn't punitive or unfair to him, essentially caveat emptor when it comes to unlawful developments. So the key lessons putting this together seem to me, firstly, that the courts continue to strive to characterise as many elements as possible of planning challenges as attacks on planning judgment as opposed to questions of law. And secondly, the courts will have little sympathy, even in extreme cases, for people who have breached planning laws. Essentially, if they bring upon themselves an unfortunate situation, that's their fault for not getting planning permission in the first place. And with that, hopefully you can still hear me. Here is this wonderful, beautiful wildlife site, which, as I said, is also a firing range. I'm now going to try and get back to my van without getting shot. Thank you very much indeed. And sorry, Steve, to miss out on the intro.
Thank you very much, Charlie. We can hear and indeed we can see you. So thanks very much. Now, Chris, over to you and the interview with Steve.
Very much, Mary, and well done with your Greenbelt case as well, if I may say so. Fantastic result. Well, my goodness, Steve Norris, everybody knows the name Steve Norris, British Conservative Party politician appointed to positions in the Department of Environment, Department of Trade and the Home Office, and then you rose to become a Transport Minister and served in that position for 4 years. And as you say, and you mentioned earlier, involved in the achievement that is the Elizabeth line at the early stage. You started your political career as a local councillor. We know plenty of those when we cross-examine them. And you rose to the position of Deputy Leader at Berkshire County Council, a progressive politician in Parliament. And I'm going to come on to that a bit later. And you're currently the chair of, as everybody knows in our industry, the National Infrastructure Planning Association, NIPA, but you're also chair of Soho Estates, as you explained a moment ago. controlling about 60 acres of London's Soho district, and chair of London Resort Company Holdings, which has a 3.5 billion entertainment resort project in Kent. And everybody also knows you from your articles in Property Week. They rate you as one of the property's top 100, and you've not been afraid to be critical of the government. And people will be very interested in that. We got a flavour of that when you started. But what I want to start with, Steve, is to thank you. Thank you. You're a busy man, all those roles, for taking the time to talk to us on Have We Got Planning News for You. And I want to start with where you started. You're a Liverpool schoolboy. You go to grammar school and you end up as a Minister of State. So how did that progression happen?
Oh, well, that's, of course, a mystery to me as much as to anybody else who watched it, I'm afraid. But no, what it is, of course, I think is a very classic post-war story. I was born literally just at the end of the Second War. So born in Liverpool, my mum and dad had met in Cornwall, where my mother was evacuated as a teacher. My father was teaching gunnery, long-range gunnery. He was brilliant man. He left school at 15, but he could do trigonometry in his head. I couldn't do trigonometry. It came in a year to read the book, you know. But I went to a great grammar school after the 11 plus. And I know we haven't got the time to talk about the merits and demerits of the system, but if you passed the 11 plus, you went, in my case, to this wonderful school called the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. And that's ironically where the Beatles connection comes from, of course, because I happened to be there with a couple of lads called Paul McCartney and George Harrison. And I remember being on Any Questions once, and they have a daft question at the end for 2.5 minutes, you know, just to make sure they run to time. And it was, have the panel ever said yes to something they wish they'd said no to? And Steve Norris, you know, that's Jonathan Dibbleby throws that to me straight away. You don't have any chance to think about it. I said, well, the one thing I do know is that, you know, my dad said to me, why don't you put that bloody guitar down and do some work? And I said, yes, Dad. And I said, I'm the not a multimillionaire, you know. Anyway, but you see, because I went to that fantastic grammar school, when I got a scholarship to Oxford, you know, nobody would have cheered particularly, because we probably have got from that school in Liverpool 6 or 7 people into Oxbridge. It was an exhibition, actually, in my case. I don't want to overstate it. And we'd have got 2 or 3 exhibitions and scholarships, and we'd have got 3 or 4 places. And that was not considered unusual, as it was not considered unusual in Manchester Grammar or King Edward VII Birmingham and so on, you know. And again, there's no point in us going over all of the politics of why the city council in Liverpool saw fit to scrap the school. A few years later, God knows what principle they thought they were following, because, you know, these were not decisions based on your income. The whole point was you could have no income at all coming into the household, but you could still get there if you can pass 11 plus. So from there, Oxford, read law, was president of the University Law Society for a term, the usual sort of nonsense. And then would have gone to the bar, except no did explain. In those days, your people master had just stopped charging you for the privilege, but certainly hadn't got around to paying you anything. And nobody paid you to do bar finals. And I had existed on a government grant, a local authority grant, actually, all the way through my sort of education. So I started off in business, turned out to be kind of quite good at it. And soon decided that I'd sooner go on making money rather than worrying about going to the bar. So, you know, the bar clearly ducked a fight in that particular event. And I, you know, how do I get into politics? Well, I was sitting at the kitchen. Our local county councillor was retiring. 2 people had put their names up to replace him. I said to my wife, God, these 2 are useless. That's old George. I wouldn't give him a job shopping sticks. And she said, no, well, actually, I don't know why you don't do that. And so I like off the donkey. And I said, do you know what? It was a kind of Kennedy moment. It was that kind of moment, you know, if not, what did he say? He said, if not me, who? If not now, when? And that whole business of, don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do. And I was really enthusiastic about that in a rather naive way, you might say. But remember, this was the sort of very early 70s. So I went on the county council, kind of enjoyed it, found out I could find my way around, and then by complete accident got elected in Oxford East as Member of Parliament in the year in which Mrs. Thatcher won everything. I should say that Oxford East, that was in 1983. We're now in 2023. And the shock of having elected me has never left the constituency. We have never elected another Tory ever in the entire history. They were so, I think, horrified by the 4 years in which I was their Member of Parliament. Incidentally, I loved them. They were great people. Used to sit in the Cowley Conservative Club where most of the members weren't Conservatives at all. They just liked a cheap pint. And we'd natter. I loved those guys. It was a wonderful seat and I really enjoyed it. Lost in 87, went back to my business. By then, I'd owned a couple of motor dealerships and I'd got an engineering business. And we did a bit of property on the side, locally down in Salisbury, actually, which is where my PhD business was. And but I put myself up as a paper candidate in Oxford East. The Tories are never going to win Oxford East. It was ridiculous. It was the rough half of Oxford. I mean, we used to call the university the Cowley Latin Quarter. But so, for what it was worth, I won on the night. And I had the job of ringing up the chap who ran my car business and saying, Tony, I've got a problem. He said, what? I said, I've won. He said, it's a bit ridiculous. I said, no. He said, oh, you had too much to drink. Go to bed. I said, no, I've won. I promise you I've won. We better meet Sunday. And so that's what happened, And so I found myself in Parliament. I'd only been there, I think, a couple of times before. I wasn't one of these obsessive, sort of young conservatives. And I actually wasn't terribly interested in the union debates at Oxford either. I thought they were, frankly, rather juvenile and trivial. But I enjoyed it very, very much. I enjoyed my time in the Department of Environment, which at that time included local government. I loved working with Nick Ridley when he was Secretary of State for Trade and Industry. I was his PPS. And, he was a marvelous brain and an incredibly kind and generous man and much maligned. His public image was not that of a particularly benevolent chap, but he was actually wonderful. And then I worked with Ken Baker in the Home Office before going into the DFT. And what I'm proud of in the DFT is actually more than the Crossrail project, because it took another nearly 20 years to actually get it started, but was the Jubilee Line extension, which the Treasury did not want. If you believe one thing about the way we work in this country, in political terms, it's that the Treasury is a dreadful drag anchor on progress in this country. The answer is no. Now, what's the question? It was summed up in that famous little note that Liam Byrne, the former Labour Chief Secretary, left for whoever was going to follow him after the 2010 election. And dear Chief Secretary, I'm sorry there's no money. Yours ever, Liam. It wasn't intended to be cynical. It's a standing joke. That's what the Chief Secretary always said to you. Yes, Steve, marvellous project. Yeah, you're quite right. I'm sure it's marvellous, but I'm afraid there's no money. Well, if there's no money to improve infrastructure, it just worsens and the whole of society suffers. And we have done ever since. Ironically, there's the link there to why later in my career, I got so interested in the way that we dealt with large infrastructure applications. I, in my case, was looking after Terminal 5. Took 10 years, cost £100 million worth of public and private money in the days when that would be multiplied several times in 2023 money. And a complete waste of time. And that was a terminal building, for God's sake. It wasn't a runway. If it had been a runway, you could maybe understand it. It's just a building. And, I remember John Major set up under the late Lord Sainsbury, John Sainsbury, sort of commission to examine how we could do this better. And basically the answer was he couldn't think of a way that we could. And, you know, when Labour introduced the 2008 Planning Act, and this whole idea of saying, well, maybe we've just got to tell local authorities what they've got to build. You know, I thought, well, two things. One, whatever one thinks of NSIPs and NPSs, more importantly, they allowed us to take a decade each off the major nuclear applications, and they've been incredibly useful in many, many cases, shortening applications to the point where a reasonable amount of time is taken and interest is taken into account. But we don't have hundreds of people turning up saying identical things to inspectors with which you either agree or disagree, which are a complete waste of time and effort. And so out of that came what I do for, if you like, for the fun and the joy of it, which is sharing NEPA have done since it started. And when they let me go, in a couple of years' time, I shall probably finish it, but I'll have been there for about 20 odd years by then. That's it.
Thank you that you've got through the first 6 questions without me asking anything. It's very impressive. And so why did you become the chair of NIPA? Who approached you, and why did you think it was important?
Well, I mean, I thought it was important because of my own experience of just how frustrating it was in a case where it seemed to me that the outcome was obvious and was obvious on day one. And yet 10 years later and £100 million later, you know, we decided that it was obvious. I got JR'd 6 times as a minister, won 5, lost 1, but won it on appeal. That, of course, is our clever lawyers in the department. And so when the Act gave birth to the idea of NPSs and NSIPs to follow them, that seemed to me to be something worth encouraging. And talking to friends, people like Robbie Owen and others, you know, you would probably know Robbie from a law firm who I probably shouldn't name, but he and I and 1 or 2 others decided we should do something about it and formed NIPA. And I think they just employed me because I was garrulous and extremely cheap. And that's continued to be the case ever since. But I love it. I love it. I mean, and I represent a particular interest, because the danger with NIPA is that because it's for lawyers by lawyers, and, you know, involving local authority people, and some of them lawyers themselves, I've always wanted to ensure that the process was one in which the interests of local residents and communities are properly taken account of and not, you know, subsidiary to the idea of the great project. The great project may very well be a game changer, and I'm thinking of things like the Thames Tideway Tunnel, which, you know, is now nearing completion, was hotly opposed by local authorities before it was given consent. And you've got to consider very, very, very carefully, where if you are going to consent to a scheme which is hotly opposed, that it's opposed for reasons which you understand and which you mitigate to the degree that's possible. And I think that's what happened in that case. It's very successful. It's going to be a massive, massive benefit to London as a city when it becomes fully operational in about 6 months' time.
Can I ask you then just to move more widely into planning and say, from your perspective, what needs to change in the English planning system?
We need to have, I suppose I often summarize it by saying somebody needs to speak for the people who haven't got a home or who haven't got a job. You know, the system is more geared to the reaction of those who are resident in an area, who have a locus in an area, who have an interest in, if you like, putting it in simple terms, leaving things as they are. Call it NIMBY, call it whatever you like. And that applies as much to an industrial application as it does to a residential application. It goes across the whole field of planning. And what's, I think, absent is not the idea that we should foreshorten public engagement or that we should somehow diminish the significance of public opposition, but that we should channel it in a way that properly recognizes all of the stakeholders in any sensible, serious application, and the stakeholder, of course, who never has any lockers, other than through the dastardly developer who's only there anyway to make a lot of money, as would be characterized. And that is the people who don't have a and God knows, I mean, part of my anger at the way that Michael has decided to tear up a system that's been the only one that's worked for the last nearly 20 years, is that he's doing it, I think, on the basis that politically there are more NIMBYs out there than there are families who would love to have their children being able to afford to own their own home, as they've done. And I think he's wrong. I just think he's politically wrong, and that he's certainly wrong in terms that the government itself set, which was to say that we should be trying to build 300,000 homes a year, even with the existing system, which they haven't fully implemented. They haven't been stringent enough with local authorities who failed to deliver the 5-year land supply approved plans. And it's outrageous that that has been allowed to happen. But nonetheless, we've never built anywhere close to 300,000. And there are many think tanks, both on the right and the left, who think that the 300,000 figure is itself inadequate. Now, you know, given that Steve Quartermain, the former chief planner who many on this call will know, has himself said he thinks the number, I heard him say this myself the other day, might very well be 130, 120, 140,000 next year if these, you know, if this is to be the regime. Local authorities are saying, happy days, happy days. We can just say, go away, we don't like it. And some of them will seize on that. I think that's dreadful. I mean, it matters most in the areas where housing is generally unaffordable for people who are desperately needed in the area. That's the other terrible, terrible consequence of what Michael Gove's doing.
So what you're talking about is this proposal to abandon the housing targets. As you say, with the long view, you're saying, look, we've always had them. We've always had them, whether it's Conservative or Labour, we've always had them because that's the only way you can make local authorities actually deliver the homes, because out of choice, 9 out of 10 local authorities would say no. And you're not the only Tory to say this, are you? I mean, the overwhelming majority of parliamentarians and ex-ministers are saying the same thing, aren't they? So, you know, my question about this is, the rebels think they've got him where they want him, which is to say we're not going to pass the levelling up bill unless you're pioneering levelling up government, levelling up bill. We won't let you pass that unless you abandon the housing target. With your political perspective, how does he get out of that one?
Well, I think I make 2 points about that. The first is about the number. They say there are about 50-something
59 or something
who are going to down a ditch over this. They said similar things about the Northern Ireland Accord, the Windsor Accord as it became known. And in the event, as you remember, it wasn't 50-something at all. It was 27. 7 of them were the Ulster Unionists, and the other 20 were the rock-solid core of, numpties who are in the in the sort of ultra Brexit position, where nothing but perfection will ever do. And I think you'd find the number would come down quite substantially if the chief whip was doing its job. But the reality is, of course, that Labour would very much support the retention of the targets. They've already pretty much made it clear that they would reinstate the regime, which, when you say we've always had it's not quite true, of course, as you know. We've had it since the passing of the 2008 Act, which actually, triggered what the Tories then tried to frustrate by introducing the Localism Act after 2010. And thank goodness that got squashed when actually many of us did say to the then Tory administration under David Cameron, this is madness. You might think this is clever, but it isn't actually clever at all, because this system is the only system that's ever delivered a serious amount of affordable housing in areas where it's needed. And so, ironically, after that, we've had this system, and it hasn't worked as well as it should, but it's certainly worked far better than this idea that these housing targets are merely advisory. I mean, I don't even know what that means. They're not big enough oh, what a shame. Tough. Go away. We've done something. And I think common sense in the end. I'm a great believer in the common sense of the British electorate. Sometimes they're thought of as being dummies who just come and put crosses in a box every 4 or 5 years. My experience of the electorate, many people who don't bother to go on Twitter or Facebook or anything else, I've still got a pretty clear idea. And I know, having looked at research, people like Ipsos Mori, very respected pollsters, who said that the graph that once said NIMBY's here and worrying about house prices there, they've seen those lines cross. More families are now worried about the fact that their children can't possibly afford to live anywhere near them than are worried about the new wimpy development at the bottom of the garden. There's a myth that actually that causes people to change their vote as well. And the number of people who say, I'm going to cut my nose off to spite my face. I know I should be conservative, but I'm not going to do it because oh gosh, yes, that means I get a government I didn't want. And I've still got the new houses at the end of them. That's called a double fail.
And Steve, my final question is on that, really. Quite clear that Mr. Gove is worried about the progress made by Liberal Democrats and so on in the local elections. They think, well, the only way we can get people voting Tory in a general election, as opposed to local elections, is if we adopt a sort of NIMBY cloak around us. We talk the language of housing delivery, but actually we turn things down. What's the answer to that? Should he cave into the threat from the Liberal Democrats? Is that the approach he should take?
No, we don't. None of us in either the Tory party or the Labour Party takes the slightest notice of the Liberal Democrats. I'm sorry, I'll stop there. Otherwise, I'll probably say something cruel and unkind, even if it were true. More seriously, there are plenty of Tories who worry greatly about the position that Michael Gove's taken. And I know that he's getting a lot of pressure from many, many people saying, Theresa Villas may have got to you. And I know Theresa, she's a perfectly decent member of Parliament and a fine parliamentarian, a good Secretary of State. But, in her constituency, I've no doubt this will resonate perfectly well. But that's because she's in a part of leafy North London where, frankly, these issues would be skewed. And there isn't much room for a new development in any event. It's pretty well built up as it is. But that's not typical of the rest of the UK. And, I think that I think we really, if we don't alter our position on this, then the risk of us being seriously disadvantaged at the time of the next election, I think is very real.
Well, you cease being the party of home ownership and you become the party of landlords and investors. And there's a lot more people who want a home than those. Okay, well, thank you very much. As ever, completely and utterly, brutally honest and fabulously clear. I'm now going to turn to Mary. And Mary, do you have a question?
I do have a question. And I just wanted to follow up from Steve's introduction, because I was very fortunate to have a local authority that paid my fees to go to bar school. And without that support, I wouldn't have been able to do it. And when I did pupillage, I had to waitress on the side to sort of pay my way through. So I know I was jolly lucky that my local authority at the time, Hertfordshire, were prepared to do that. Anyway, my question is all about the proposed infrastructure levy, Steve, that this government, in their wisdom, proposed to introduce. And I'm asking, is it necessary? And if so, why do you think it's necessary? And will it really solve infrastructure issues? Or will it, in fact, put more pressure on ill-equipped officers and members to actually deliver the infrastructure? That's sort of my headline point. And bearing in mind your particular expertise in London, I'm also wondering, will retaining the mayoral still in London whilst also introducing the infrastructure levy, will that in fact remove the debate about viability, which seems to be driving, I think, the government's desire to introduce this infrastructure levy? Or is it an ill-judged attempt to try and capture and share increased land value? I haven't.
It's a good question, but I think my starting point, Mary, is that we now have a Section 106 and SIL arrangement, which is almost immediately, obviously, just very, very messy. We were involved in a case a couple of years ago where we were charged a Section 106 on 3 houses only in a central London location, which, if we were to renew that application today, wouldn't qualify for Section 106. And the difference was substantial six-figure difference. And where does SIL and Section 106 actually sort of intersect with each other? Is it one or both or whatever? So ostensibly, the idea of saying, look, every developer has to recognize that they need to contribute something to reflect the impact of their development. The classic, of course, phrasing around Section 106 was to mitigate the impact of development, and it meant building the necessary roadworks or road improvements if you're going to introduce another 200 houses with cars onto the road system and so on, then got so adulterated as to be just checkbook planning. How much do you want? Where do you want the nice swimming pool or whatever? I mean, it's got nothing to do with the building that I'm actually going to build. I think some form of reform, therefore, is a good idea. And ostensibly, the infrastructure levy replaces these two rather confused ideas of SIL and 106 and says, let's put it together. Let's look at the actual value that is being generated here and give the developer a reasonable amount of certainty in advance as to what it is this is going to cost him or her. And I think that really is the nub. So I want it to work. The problem is that on the drafts that we've seen, you'll know this better than me, there are one or two areas which are very unclear still. And until they're resolved, I certainly wouldn't be happy to see the current draft go into, be translated into law. The London point, again, you see, I don't really see the case, if you understand what the infrastructure levy is supposed to be, for having a separate regime in London, because the value that's being created, everybody knows that when you're developing in London, you're building around house prices of anything from, well, nobody in London's paying less than 500 quid a foot. And, in many cases, you're developing properties where values are well in excess of £1,000 a foot. You don't get that in Liverpool. You don't get that in Manchester. You don't get that in most of the rest of the country. So London doesn't need a separate, different infrastructure levy. The devil is in the detail. But if the detail's right, then I would put it to you, Mary, that scrapping this mess of Section 106 over here, SIL over here, and you often are negotiating for years after you've completed the development of the Section 106, which to me is just intolerable. The developer is entitled to say, this is how much it's going to cost me. I know that in advance, and you get your money the minute I finish my development.
I'd love to debate this with you, Steve, but I can't hog all the time, and there are other questions. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary. Charlie, if you can hear us.
I can indeed, Chris. Thank you. I made it out live. Steve, my question is this. Is it too late? Is it too late for the government to win the hearts and minds of the development of the infrastructure sector? And if it's not too late, how does it go about doing so from the current standing point?
Oh, you know what, Charlie? I think I've almost answered this. Right now, most of the real serious property-based donors to the Conservative Party are saying you can swing for it. These guys are the kind of people whose checks make campaigns work. And without them, the Conservative Party is in trouble. You've seen what's happened to Labour when some of the big unions have said you're going to the right, with Corbyn and all the rest of it. These things matter a lot. So yeah, I'm afraid I think we've lost the industry right now, and the Conservative Party will be feeling that pinch really hard. That pressure is going to continue. There'll be a lot of it at the party conference in October. I'm pretty clear about that. I think what could change it is if Rishi Sunak were to say, I've listened. I know that Michael, thought he was doing the right thing, but on this, I'm going to tell him that I don't agree with him. We're going to leave the status quo. It's worked. And actually, what we really should be doing is using some of the MPPF provisions to really make local authorities, do something about that 5-year land supply. Because we still know cases, several very close to East London, to my own constituency. My constituency, Epping Forest is one of them, where the answer is no, go away. And that's just unacceptable.
Yeah, what an interesting answer that is, Charlie, eh? What an interesting answer that is.
If only someone could send this interview to him.
Yeah, imagine that. Right, Paul, your question, please.
I could sit and listen to you all day and listen to the answers you've given to Chris. We could keep this webcast going for hours, but I've got a slightly different tack. So, since the abolition of regional strategies, the experience of those at the sharp end of planning, by which I mean me, of very large-scale key projects and decisions, is that they're all too often put into the too difficult pile for local authorities, particularly when councils are preparing their local plans. And part of that seems to be because we've got the duty to cooperate, which has replaced regional planning, rather than authorities being told this is what you have to plan for on a super-district basis. So has the time come to admit we were wrong to abolish regional planning?
You did very kindly let me, have some advance notice of that question, Paul, and it's the one that I found hardest to answer because there's merit in some of the arguments around regional planning, but regions are very, very difficult to actually to comprehend in terms of what development can actually imply. Who's got to house the next great nuclear reactor, or who's got to house the next great reservoir, which we need, because God knows if we're not storing enough water these days, we're likely to run dry far too often, with climate change being as immediate and real as it is. I do cling to the NSIP process as a way in which these major projects can be advanced. And I think the success rate has been pretty impressive. I mean, the number that are actually refused by the inspectorate, having gone through the process, you'll know this better than me, is very small. And in general, I mean, they if you take out things like road projects and energy projects, that's admittedly the vast majority of them. But it's not helped by the fact, of course, that the NPSs themselves are now running out of date in several cases and really urgently need to be updated. Not all of them, but certainly some of them. And John Armitt at the NLSC, of course, has been making this case as well. We have certainly, talking to DLUC, been making that point to them. So I think I wasn't ever terribly comfortable with regional planning. I accept that there's a too difficult proposition around, but using the NSIP system does give a developer the opportunity to present the advantages and disadvantages. And for example, if you were sort of National Power Networks or whatever, and you were told this community wants you to bury all of your cabling, and you say, well, I understand that, and if this is an AONB or if it's a particularly, impacted site, then maybe we'd have to do that. But you do understand, don't you, that burying the cable is 4 times more expensive than gantries. And if we do put up, the usual sort of gantries, in the main, what that's doing is delivering better value for the consumer. You may very well be the consumer in that case yourselves. And that ability to sort of talk to communities, which is implicit in the NSIP process when it's working properly, is something that I think should not deter developers from coming forward with the big plan, because it is a regime in which it's less adversarial. There's more opportunity for communities to put their point of view and for there to be some sort of transactional deal, if you like, on what would be acceptable to both sides. I think it's a difficult one, I really do. But the trouble is, change generally only makes things worse.
That's true enough. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. That's an interesting question, isn't it? Well, if people won't accept it was a mistake, perhaps another party will introduce it again.
Oh,
Sasha.
Gosh, the ability of politicians to recycle things that we dead for decades on the grounds that somehow we've frustrated Einstein's law that, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different answer is the height of stupidity. Something that Mrs. May should have remembered when she took the same bill through Parliament. God knows how many times it got the same answer. But no, there's nothing like recycling the old rubbish. We're very, very good at that.
Sasha, do you have a question?
Yes, very quickly, Steve. Can I leave the murky waters of planning for a moment and just ask for you? You've obviously been through many, many general elections. If you had to predict next December and the outcome, would you be pretty firm that there's going to be a Labour majority government?
No, not at all.
Oh.
Not at all. The real question that politicians are asking themselves is this 92 or 97? Of course, refer to two very, very interesting elections. In 1992, the Tories had been in for 13 years. I knew I'd win my seat, made 20-odd thousand majority. They didn't even count them, just weighed them. It was easier, quicker. But the truth is, I thought we'd lose. I actually thought we'd lose the election. And it wasn't until, the famous Basildon results by, sadly, late, very good friend David Amos, who was murdered, as you know, a year or so ago. But whatever, I mean, the truth is, we won. And the reason we won was because people were tired of us, bored with us, didn't think we got anything left in the tank. But they looked across at the alternative. And this is sometimes forgotten. It wasn't Neil Kinnock necessarily, as much as John Smith's shadow budget, which he'd rather foolishly published, which basically said every single taxpayer in the country, never mind rich or poor, was going to be significantly worse off. And people said, no, we're not ready for that. And so they re-elected us. And then they hated us. They thought, oh God, we got the Tories back again. And I remember the next 5 years as being unmitigated hostility from the press, from the media, from everybody. In fact, it was quite funny because I'd go on Question Time, the TV program, and get howled down routinely. If I'd read the Sermon on the Mount, I got howled down. A year later, I was going on as basically opposition. I was there as a sort of Tory in opposition. And everything I said got a roar of applause. I was saying the same stuff. But, the difference was that in 97, A, we'd have 5 more boring years, and B, Mr. Blair was in his pomp. Tony Blair is an exceptional politician. It must be odd because I quite like Tony. He's a good guy. He made some terrible mistakes, and of which Iraq was the most obvious. In the end, his party got rid of him because they could see he was a Tory. That's why I liked it. That's why he was a good party. I keep reminding people, what was the top rate of tax under Tony Blair for 10 years? 40p in the pound. So when old Kwasi said he was going to bring it back to 40p, you'd think he was sort of, doing something extraordinary. It's the same rate of tax we had under Labour for 10 years. And Blair made the difference. Now, I'm sorry to say that 2 things are now happening if you were waiting for a Labour win. One is that Sunak, common sense, grown up, thank God, with a common sense grown up chancellor, has taken the deficit from 27 points down to about 15. And that's just in a matter of a few months. The next election is likely to be October of 2024. In other words, it's 15 months away from now. And a lot happens in 15 months. not to mention, for example, to pretty much give away budgets, because we've taken the pain. That was necessary. Markets have stabilized, rates have risen. It's all not great. We know that. But the fact is, we can now afford to relax. And that relaxation will all be part of a strategy that takes that closing of the gap down. Now, Sir Keir is obviously a decent chap, and I wish him no ill, but he's not Tony Blair. And actually, Tony Blair's great companion, Gordon Brown, was seen as the brain box. And actually, of course, he was more to the right than Tony in terms of the way that he ran the economy when he was Chancellor. Labour's deputy leader now is one Angela Rayner. Now, I pray for Angela's good health and survival every night, because I think she's actually a Tory mole. I think she's been put there by Tory central office. And probably, one day she'll admit it on her deathbed and say, yeah, I was a Tory all along. Go out there and outrage Middle Britain. Outrage those millions of people who voted Tory, in 2019 and say they're all scum. Yeah, let's have a bit more of that, Ange. Come on, girl. Let's have a bit more. I'm also entirely persuaded by a Labour Chancellor who thinks that if you abolish non-dom status, you're going to make 3 billion. Actually, you need to sort of breathe into Rachel's fragrant ear that the greater likelihood is that most of the non-doms will simply leave. They'll go places where you don't pay any tax at all, much more comfortable, the climate's generally better. I mean, actually, you should be lucky to make anything out of taxing non-doms, but then the politics of envy, in the end, never really work. So I think we could well see, and many of the pollsters who've looked forward would agree with this, quite likely to see a hung parliament. Could be with the Tories being the largest single party, maybe Labour being the largest single party, but they have a big hill to climb to get any majority. It's not they're going to win over 100 seats just to get a majority of one. Easier, it has to be said, by the collapse, if you like, of the Scottish National Party. Quite extraordinary phenomenon. We haven't seen the like of that ever in political history. But that means Labour probably pick up another 20 seats in Scotland, which they wouldn't have expected to win even 6 months ago. That does swing the balance slightly, but it means that the outlook for the 2024 election is still, I think, far too unclear for anybody to be talking about who they think is going to be in the next government. This could well be another 92, in other words, rather than 97. In 92, everybody said, the Tories are going to lose. People like me believe we were going to lose. We didn't lose. And it was because, not that they loved us, but because they looked across and they said, no, you're not ready yet. And that, I think, is going to be the core of what will happen throughout politics for the next 15 months.
So, Sasha, thank you very much. You've asked a politician who's going to win the next election. I should not have expected anything less than a 15-minute answer. Steve, absolute pleasure to have you on. But I think we all agree. I don't think Labour can count on the next victory at all. And your insight and your long view, absolutely fantastic. We're extremely grateful. I have to say, I think we should continue this debate in the American bar in the Savoy very soon, because I think a whole evening with you discussing this would be fantastic. I've been drinking a Cosmopolitan from Coventry. I'm going to hand back to you, Mary.
I think an evening in the Savoy bar would be an absolute drinking whatever cocktail anybody wants. Would be absolutely amazing.
Moonwalker is the only cocktail to have.
But meanwhile, can I just say, Steve and I have a hot date to get to. So thank you very much, Chris, for a great interview. Thank you, Steve, for being so open, frank and entertaining. And thank you very much to Sasha, the intrepid Charlie, and the lovely King of the North. And viewers and listeners, we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time, where we will have Dr. Sue Young from the Wildlife Trust as our esteemed guest. Meanwhile, take care and farewell.
Cheers, Steve. Mary. Thanks, Steve.
Pleasure with you. Real pleasure.